Well, howdy, everybody, and welcome back to the farm. Welcome to The Bronze Age Collapse, Volume 6. As promised, today we're going to be talking about Moses and burning bushes, circumcision, Egyptian pharaohs, murder plots, and we're going to talk about how on earth would lamb's blood protect you from a volcano. Then we'll end up starting our discussion of Theseus and his founding of Athens, and what this story says about the Bronze Age collapse and the Greek-speaking world after Odysseus. Speaking of Odysseus, I have not seen the Odyssey yet. I will probably end up seeing it twice. So that's a solid 6 hours of my life that I will be sacrificing to the great god of cinema, Christopher Nolan. And in typical fashion, it looks like Christopher Nolan did his research about the Bronze Age collapse to make sure that his interpretation of the Odyssey fit into some kind of real historical context, even though, obviously, his production design and costumes and his casting doesn't match the actual period. But Nolan is right when he says that all of these stories have been heavily mythologized and modified to suit cultures that arose later on after the Bronze Age collapse. After all, Homer's epics were not written down until as late as the 500s BC. In other words, 500 years, or half a millennium, after the actual events. So we should not expect a lot of accuracy in terms of the details. But in the past, when we have found physical evidence or inscriptions or lost scrolls that talk about historical events that were originally recorded just through oral traditions, we tend to find things that match up. We find similarities. We generally don't find that the stories were just plain made up out of nowhere. And so when we look at Moses or Theseus, it's safe to say that we're observing some of the cultural echoes of the Bronze Age collapse. We're learning something, little hints about real people who lived during this crazy time. And so, since Nolan did his homework, apparently the sea peoples are mentioned in the Odyssey, and at one point, Odysseus, aka Matt Damon, reveals his guilt about taking part in what would eventually become a massive looting campaign that triggered, or at least underlined, the collapse of the Bronze Age civilization that had been built up over the last few thousand years. And a lot of this civilization was heavily dependent on the importation of tin. Copper was easy to find in the Mediterranean. In fact, the most famous source of copper was this island called the Copper Island, a big island in the eastern Aegean off the coast of Turkey. And you may notice that the abbreviation for the element copper on the periodic table of elements is not CO. It's not capital C, lowercase o, as you might expect for copper. It's Cu, and that comes from the Latin cuprum, which comes from the Greek kypron, and that would be transliterated Cypron, kypron. Now the Romans would interpret this Greek Y, this U sound, which is very similar to the German umlaut U, as in Uber, in Übermensch. But the Romans just considered it a short U. So that gives us cuprum, where we get the elemental symbol of copper. Now let's talk about this island what would the island of Copper be in Greek, which would be the language of the people who lived there throughout the classical period? Well, it was Kypros, which we now call Cyprus, thanks to the French softening all the C's into S sounds. But sure enough, Cyprus was famous for its copper mines. And so, in order to make bronze, you got to combine copper with tin. And tin was the thing that was hard to find. Tin was the rare commodity. And the rulers of the Bronze Age scoured the world, the flat earth that they saw themselves inhabiting, looking for sources of tin. And it may be the case that the need for tin from far-flung places like Britain, which was a major source of tin, even for the Egyptians. So in order to protect such a long and arduous and tenuous trade route, you're going to want to pacify some people, suppress piracy, create some outposts for security. And so now, it's no surprise that the Egyptian pharaohs, especially Ozymandias, Ramses II, it makes perfect sense that he would send his fleet to the Western Mediterranean to cut down on piracy because he needed that tin. For the ruling elites of the Bronze Age, tin was just as important and just as valuable and precious a commodity as beef jerky would be for the powers that be now. Our elites love some beef jerky. Just get online and Google 3 words, beef and jerky, Jerky, and Epstein. The rulers of Egypt and Canaan and Assyria and Troy, they all were dependent on this constant importation of this rare and hard-to-mine metal. Bronze is not so valuable or difficult to make anymore. And so, who destroyed all this? Who were the pirates and the coastal raiders and pillagers that helped bring this system tumbling down in the 12th century BC? Who were these people? Well, the first person that comes to mind is Christopher Nolan and his vision of Odysseus. I was following the consensus of historians and based on Egyptian records that these people called the Sea Peoples were the catalysts of the final collapse into isolation and barbarism for 400 years. And in previous volumes of the Bronze Age collapse, I had said that Odysseus was a sea people. And apparently, in the Odyssey, spoiler alert, there's a point where Odysseus, aka Matt Damon, has a moment of self-reflection and a horrific realization comes to him and he collapses to his knees and he cries out to the sky, "I am a sea people." Just like Vincent said. I don't think he says exactly that. It's probably a little bit different. Nolan knew that if he used my name, he'd have to pay me some money, so he left me out of it. But apparently he does agree with this current historical consensus about how the Bronze Age collapse happened. And I think it's worth going back to the monument of the Battle of the Delta that was erected by Ramses III's successor. And remember, to help differentiate all these pharaohs, I've been calling Ramses III Lil Ramses. And so Lil Ramses famously destroyed a huge army of sea peoples in 1175 BC, which is only 4 years after the sack of Troy, which occurred in 1179 BC. So it would be kind of a stretch to argue that this is not related. or that the people who attacked Troy were not sea peoples. They were something else. And it's just a big coincidence. Just a big misunderstanding over a breach in xenia, or the rules of hospitality, which we'll talk about later on. And so this monument talking about the sea peoples, what does it say? We've talked about it before, but it's worth repeating. And so the translation of the monument, in part, is as follows. As for these foreign countries, they made a conspiracy among their islands. No land could stand before their arms. They desolated the people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. They were coming, while the flames were prepared before them, forward toward Egypt. Their confederation was the Peleset, Theker, Shekelesh, Dinyan, and Weshesh. Lands united. They lay their hands upon the earth, to the very circuit of the earth. And their hearts were confident and trusting. Our plans will succeed. And then, of course, the monument goes on to explain that they did not succeed. They may have succeeded at Troy, thanks to the little trick that Odysseus had planned. And note that the Peleset that were mentioned have been identified with certain cultures from Canaan itself. Then the Shekelesh were the Sickles, a group of people from what's now Sicily. Sicilia, the original Latin name for Sicily, came from these people. And then let's skip to the Weshesh, which refers to a Celtic people from southern Italy. And then note that they mentioned the Dinyan. This has been identified with the Danaans, or the Danaoi, and Odysseus and his friends are identified as Danaoi. So they're pretty much directly mentioned. Some Danaoi died in Egypt. They didn't go home after Troy. So geologists have been finding a layer of ash that they have connected with the eruption of a volcano named Hekla in Iceland. And they know it happened around this time. There's some definite debate, but the range is within 100 or so years. There's one theory that dates the eruption of the Hekla volcano to 1159 BC, which makes it very interesting for the story I'm trying to tell. So in 1175, Egypt defeats the Sea Peoples, resettles some of the survivors to the outskirts of northern Egypt. But it turns out that even at that point, Egypt was starting to lose power. This had a lot to do with the constant raiding, the military overextension, and also economic problems. Egypt was already having trouble feeding itself to the level that it was accustomed to. But then everything started to fall apart in 1159. And I'm claiming that this is around the time that Moses and his brother, or half-brother, Aaron, led a group of people out of Egypt, headed east into Sinai, with the ultimate goal of making it back to Canaan. And even the Exodus story lays much of the credit for the success of the Exodus with the plagues of Egypt. And of course, Moses and the Israelites interpreted these plagues of Egypt to be the will of God, or the wrath of Yahweh. And one thing to note about all 10 plagues of Egypt is that they all share a connection to the weather, or the ecology surrounding the Egyptian cities, especially Pyramessa, as I'm going to argue, which was already founded on a marsh, and its primary source of drinking water was not the Nile River. It was an offshoot from the Nile River because Pyramessa was built far north in Egypt in a region where the Nile branches off into 100 different streams on their way to the Mediterranean. And so, what were these plagues of Egypt? Well, the first thing they talk about are rivers of blood, that the sources of fresh water turned into blood. Now, I think this is an echo of the memory of waterways surrounding Pyramessa silting up, perhaps with iron ore, sometimes referred to as rust. There are also algae blooms and other microorganisms that could cause this red color and even change the viscosity of the water. And I can see how that would be interpreted as waterways turning into blood. Then there was a giant cloud of darkness where you couldn't even see your hand in front of your face, and that plagued Egypt. Then there was fiery hail, hot stones falling from the sky, and now I think you're starting to see what I'm seeing. Those plagues seem to be referring to something in the air, something falling out of the sky, debris, dust. And gosh, I wonder where all of that came from. Well, of course, I'm arguing that this was because of the volcanic eruption. And then, of course, once you blot out the sun for more than a couple of years, and when you take away sources of fresh running water in a marshland, you're going to run into the problems that are described next. So some of the other plagues of Egypt include ecological problems. We have, of course, locusts, but we also have flies, lice, and frogs. And I'm going to argue that this is a memory of the change in the ecology of the land around Pyramessa because of the crop failures and the lack of running water. And then we have 3 indicators of disease, perhaps diseases caused by the weakness that would be induced by starvation. The first thing to go was the livestock. The livestock died either of starvation or dehydration or some sort of disease. Then humans break out in boils. These are often associated with different varieties of the plague because, for example, the Black Death in Europe in the 1300s would cause these boils or abscesses to form in certain parts of the body. So I think this is a pretty clear and direct reference to disease. And then an indirect reference to disease is our final plague, the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will, the one that caused Lil Ramses to finally let go of his slave population, and that was the death of the firstborn. On one fateful night, the angel of death came to Egypt and killed the firstborn son of every Egyptian. But it didn't kill the firstborn sons of people who were loyal to Yahweh. And we'll talk about how the angel of death could tell one from the other. And the Exodus story says that the angel of death did kill the firstborn son of the Pharaoh. So, being desperate to prove my own theory, I did search for whatever information we might have for the sons of Little Ramses. And like many pharaohs, Little Ramses had dozens of sons. He had a lot of them, including one that would later plot against him and was implicated in the conspiracy to assassinate him. He had another son who succeeded him after being cleared of the conspiracy to murder Lil Ramses. So Lil Ramses' son, Ramses IV, assumed the throne after his father was killed. But none of these guys was the first son of Lil Ramses. It turns out Lil Ramses' son didn't get to have much of a political career because he died when he was young. Now, the sources say when he was a teenager. And remember, the Exodus story doesn't say that they were infants. It's whoever the firstborn son was. And so that's a lot of people. And I do think that is a pretty good cultural representation of a plague that struck everybody in Egypt, including the nobility. And when plagues reach the nobility or the priesthood of a culture, boy, that's when it really gets remembered. When a disease only affects dock workers or sailors or shepherds, well, then people aren't too concerned. So Lil Ramses' son did die during this time, and I'm claiming that the 10 plagues of Egypt represent the ecological disaster that resulted from not only the eruption of that volcano, but also the pre-existing decline of Egyptian power. And in previous volumes of the Bronze Age collapse, we talked about various indicators of the decline of Egyptian power. What does that look like? What are some of the hints that we have scattered in the evidence? Well, we definitely have references to an overextension of Egyptian power. We have fighting in Libya. We have Egyptian armies marching through Sinai to punish city-states in Canaan that had rebelled against the power of the pharaoh. And as I just mentioned, we had Egyptian fleets operating in the Western Mediterranean. All of this stuff is very expensive. In fact, building a naval fleet for the Egyptians was quite a feat, considering that Egypt was perpetually low on timber. Pretty much all of the large-scale lumber that Egyptians used had to be imported. And I think that's one reason why we see that so much of Egyptian construction and their monuments were made purely out of stone. And there was a story of one pharaoh actually sending an army into Lebanon to cut down an entire forest, some of the famous cedar trees of Lebanon, and all of that lumber was brought back to Egypt. And the peak of this appears to have occurred under the reign of Ramses II, Ozymandias, who seems to have tried to control the entire Mediterranean basin through sheer military force. And that's going to drain your treasury. And when you can't pay your army, and later on when you can't even feed your army, you're going to run into problems. And in previous volumes, we also talked about the strikes and the riots that broke out among Egyptian citizens, high-ranking Egyptian citizens. These strikes seem to have occurred as a result of a lack of food among the high-ranking builders and artisans in central Egypt. And, of course, I'm blaming this lack of food on 3 years of crop failures after the eruption of the volcano in Iceland in 1159 BC. And geologists have estimated that this eruption was severe enough to block out the sun to some extent for the next 20 years. And so you had complete crop failures in the few years following the eruption, and the sun wasn't revealed fully to the people of the earth until about 1140 BC. And so during this very difficult time, Ramses III had to deal with Moses and Aaron and their movement, which resulted in the loss of a major portion of the cheap labor that the Pharaoh's government had become dependent on, and they were willing to use military force once again to keep these people in line. But I'm arguing that we can see in the Exodus story that circumstances had brought Egypt to its knees. The plagues of Egypt represent the difficult time period after this volcanic eruption, and the Israelites unified with other rebel factions, and they left Egypt to go back to where their ancestors were from, hoping to settle down into a land where there was more freedom to practice their religion, where they weren't under the thumb of the Pharaoh, and where there was more food. Because right now, northern Egypt had turned into a dangerous, disease-ridden marsh. And so, after Moses leaves, after the Israelites set out on their journey east into Sinai, after 4 years of ecological disasters and economic devastation, and after losing his firstborn son to disease, people had begun to lose confidence in Lil Ramses, and it turns out that a group of women that were close to the Pharaoh hatched a conspiracy to assassinate him and place one of their favored sons on the throne. And the cool thing is that the Egyptians kept very good records, and the trial that was overseen by the successor of Lil Ramses, Ramses IV, who was not implicated in the conspiracy. And there was a trial, and we have the transcripts on papyrus scrolls. And from what we can tell, this assassination plot was the brainchild of one of Lil Ramses' 3 wives. And in particular, this wife was named Tiye. And Tiye wanted her son Pentaweret to be the successor of Lil Ramses. And about a dozen people were directly implicated, including royal servants, people who oversaw the treasury, and members of the army. Now, unfortunately for weirdos like me, the scrolls don't indicate the manner of death or how these people were punished or executed. But we know that the principal movers in the plot were, of course, executed, and the higher-ranking conspirators were given the grace of being allowed to commit suicide on their own using poison. And in antiquity, whenever people of high rank were executed, it generally just involved beheading. All the other tortures were for lower-ranking people. And there were additional trials afterward that investigated different aspects of the plot. And when it was all said and done, 38 people were executed. And what's worse, at least in the Egyptian mind, Tiye and her son Pentaweret were buried in a tomb after their execution. But their tombs were robbed of all the grave goods that they would have had, and inscriptions that showed their names were destroyed, sanded off, erased, so that their memories were removed from history, and they would not enjoy their rank in the afterlife. Now, the actual assassination is pretty straightforward. The weird thing is that we actually have Lil Ramses' body. His very well-preserved body, his mummy, is still held at a museum in Cairo, in Egypt. And some medical scientists from the University of Cairo, a while back, performed CT scans on Lil Ramses' mummy, and they concluded that he died from having his throat cut so forcefully that the knife actually carved a gouge into his cervical vertebrae of his neck. And so they concluded that this wound was quick, massive, and almost instantaneously fatal. In other words, he was nearly beheaded with a knife. So it looks like Tiye and Pintaweret hired the right guy to do the actual murder, because he was very quick about it. And there was no doubt as to whether Lil Ramses could survive. And so poor Lil Ramses met his end after an environmental disaster that he couldn't have foreseen. And after the interference of these rebel and Israelite leaders that, I would argue, 20 years earlier would have had no chance defying the power of the Pharaoh. But now that Egypt is in this low point, they are crediting their one God, Yahweh, for bringing down this reign of destruction on Egypt and bringing it to its knees so that the Israelites and their allies could leave and search for a better life outside this muddy, fly-infested death trap that Egypt had become. So I am arguing that the timeline was a little skewed or confused after 400 years of oral tradition. I'm claiming that when Hekla erupted, Moses had already fled into Midian, and he returned and united with Aaron when he heard about all the troubles that were going on in Egypt. And this accounts for the passage in Exodus where Moses is told that the people that were searching for him because of the murder he committed were dead, and they were no longer a problem. And so why was Moses so motivated? What changed his mind? What gave him the confidence, the ambition, and the authority to go back to Egypt and confront the Pharaoh, and then lead a group of starving people into the desert? Well, I'm claiming that Moses had a strange encounter in Midian, which is now in Saudi Arabia, or Saudi Arabia. Midian is in the northwest corner, close to the Sinai Peninsula, and the Pentateuch tells us that Moses was serving as a shepherd over Jethro's flocks. And so, one evening, when Moses was watching over his flock near this place called Mount Horeb, he saw something. And a lot of people, ever since antiquity, have been trying to pin down exactly which mountain is Mount Horeb, because there are a lot of mountains in that area. But the Exodus story calls this particular mountain the Mountain of God. So Horeb is the Mountain of God. We don't know exactly which one it was, but archaeologists have been searching and sifting through the sands of that region for a long time now. I'm not sure what they think they're going to find, because according to Exodus, all Moses saw was a light. Now, the Exodus text doesn't say that he saw a light. They say that he saw a bush that appeared to be on fire, but it was not being consumed. Now, if you think about what a flame might look like to someone from the Bronze Age, when they notice that nothing is being charred and no smoke is coming off the flame, that would look weird. And to me, that sounds like a Bronze Age person's interpretation of a bright light. Just a big, bright light. And Moses was curious as to what this was, so he started climbing up the side of Mount Horeb, trying to see what this light was up close. And that's when Moses heard a voice. And the voice instructed him to take off his sandals, because the area around the light was sacred. Now, Moses and this being represented by the light have a long conversation, a tense conversation. The being gives Moses the job of going back to Egypt and confronting the Pharaoh, and Moses protests. He has a problem with that because, as he tells this being, I'm not an eloquent guy. I don't know how to talk to people. I'm just some Egyptian's illegitimate son who stabbed somebody and had to leave because he was wanted for murder. No, Moses doesn't say that. But what he does say implies as much. And this being is annoyed and explains to him that he invented the human mouth and language, and he would give Moses the eloquence that was needed, and his brother Aaron could help out. And probably the most famous part of this exchange is when Moses asks this being, what is the name of this God that is sending me back to Egypt? And this being explains that his name is I am who I am, or I am he who is. Now, this is a kind of cryptic name, and of course, the way you would say this phonetically is Yahweh. Now, remember in previous volumes I talked about how Yahweh may be an abbreviation of El Yahweh Sabaoth, which is the God who brings forth armies, the Lord of hosts, a phrase that you read in the Old Testament a lot. And a lot of people wonder, what does that mean? Lord of hosts. Well, a host is an archaic word for an army. A bunch of armed men ready to do some dirty deeds. We can see a connection there because El is God, Sabaoth is a host, and then Yahweh is the person who does that, who brings that, or who does something. He who something. So there's a grammatical connection there. All we can say is that this being gave Moses a cryptic name and gave him a job to do, and also gave him some special powers. In the Exodus story, you can read about God giving Moses the power to turn a staff into a snake. He could also turn his hand leprous, but then cure the leprosy by placing it back inside his cloak. He also had the power to turn water into blood. Of course, I'm suggesting that these are mythological elements, but they do represent the idea that God gave Moses certain powers, powers that would convince people to follow him, powers that would intimidate the Pharaoh. And of course, the power to turn water into blood, I think, is an echo of the ecological problems and the waterways silting up and becoming sluggish, useless streams of red mud. And so Moses set out from Midian back to Egypt. And what was his exact plan? Well, according to Exodus, he was going to meet up with Aaron, then go to Pyramessa, and somehow get an audience with the Pharaoh, and explain to him that the Israelites wanted to set out east into the wilderness so that they could offer prayers and ritual sacrifices to their God. In other words, they wanted to have a Burning Man festival in Sinai, but without the drugs and the sex, just a lot of praying and sacrificing. So that was the plan. But on the way to Pyramessa, it appears that Moses ran into some problems. We're not sure what the exact circumstances are. I suspect it may have been disease, maybe some sort of injury. But Exodus says that Yahweh tried to kill Moses. In other words, Moses became ill, and the people surrounding him suspected that there was some reason why God was interfering with the mission that he had just given him. And the reason why they thought Moses was being attacked by Yahweh can be discerned by the solution they came up with. It turns out his wife, Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, the priest, figured out a way to heal Moses, to save him. And what did she do? Well, she took a stone knife, one of those super sharp ones made of obsidian or flint, and she circumcised her son. Presumably he was very young. She cut off his foreskin, and then she held the bloody, severed foreskin against Moses, and it healed him. I think the idea here is that Moses was not circumcised, and he had not followed the circumcision tradition with his own son. This is more evidence, I think, that Moses was raised as an Egyptian, that his father was culturally Egyptian, and that Moses converted to monotheism as an adult, later in his life. And there are differences between him and Aaron that reflect that Moses was kind of a work in progress when it came to coming to terms with Yahweh and what Yahweh wanted from people, where Aaron had been trained from birth in the Abrahamic tradition. So it goes without saying that Aaron was circumcised and all of his sons would be circumcised. But there seems to be some sort of difference with Moses. Now, this is a weird story, and it's a story that shows tension not only between Moses and Yahweh, but also between Moses and his wife, Zipporah. In Exodus, when she holds the foreskin against Moses, she says to Moses that he is a bridegroom of blood. Now, that phrase has a long history of interpretation because it's kind of difficult to translate. Bridegroom of blood is one translation. Another one is blood-stained husband, bloody husband. Or, my favorite, husband of horror, a husband of horrors. That may be an echo of Zipporah perhaps expressing some regret. I mean, after all, she probably thought she was just marrying some exceptionally high-cultured shepherd, and they would spend their lives peacefully in Midian. But then her husband talks to a bright light on the side of a mountain and decides he's going to go lead a rebellion against the Pharaoh of Egypt. Now, a lot of people are wondering whether Zipporah came from a tradition of circumcision, because it appears that she knew how to do it, and she guessed that that might be the reason why Moses was being, quote-unquote, attacked. It makes you wonder, her father being a priest, was Jethro versed in circumcision? I mean, we all know that circumcision had become standard and a big deal when the Jews emerge in the classical period. And so their writings about circumcision might be hazy or confused or conflicting when they talk about circumcision during the Bronze Age. In other words, we don't know how important circumcision actually was to the Israelites in the 12th century BC. We know it was super important after about 900 BC. And of course, based on all my other theories, I'm going to go ahead and say that circumcision may actually have gone all the way back to Abram or Abraham in Mesopotamia, and that's way, way back. Moses himself was not circumcised as a child because of his Egyptian heritage, and I think this story also reflects the fact that after Moses' conversion, and after he began to follow this Yahweh God that would become associated with the El that Aaron was worshiping, after all of this, Moses did not choose to circumcise himself as an adult. And it's easy to imagine the reasons for that. It would be an extremely painful and risky procedure, given the medical technology of the time. And I can't help but wonder whether Moses not being circumcised was yet another reason why the priesthood would proceed through the sons of Aaron and not the sons of Moses. So, in the next volume, we'll talk more about the departure from Egypt and what it might mean. And in particular, we're going to talk about the Passover event and the Jewish festival that emerged in the classical period. And the claims are, of course, that this ceremony is a reflection of the Israelites surviving the great plagues of Egypt. In particular, the death of the firstborn sons in Egypt at the hands of the angel of death. And as many of you may recall, according to the Passover tradition, the angel of death passed over every house in Egypt that had painted its doorposts and lintels with the blood of a sacrificed lamb. And of course, in Christianity, this would be seen as a kind of prefiguring of Christ. One more element of the progressive revelation, where a blood sacrifice is seen as a way to avert the wrath of God. It's a way to assert your trust in Yahweh, your cultural separation from the misguided polytheistic people that you may end up living among. I also think that the Passover event and this supposed power of lamb's blood or of animal sacrifice reinforces the idea that Yahweh is a God of shepherds. He's a God of people who follow a pastoral lifestyle. He's a God of animal sacrifice and of plague and death. But we once again see this division between pastoral people and farmers who relied on agriculture and growing grain. And during the plagues of Egypt, when all the crops were gone, when dark clouds prevented sunlight, and after locusts had eaten all the stubble, the farmers had nothing to eat. Egypt without its grain is a pretty sad and scary place. So I think that this story about the lamb's blood tells us a lot about the cultural tensions that were going on at the time and how the Israelites saw themselves as being fundamentally different from the Egyptians. We know that Moses started a movement and guided people out of Egypt, and his descendants and Aaron's descendants settled in Canaan and became a big problem. Genocidal troublemakers who did not value the life of polytheists, especially people from cultures that still practiced human sacrifice. And that was seen as a justification. Although I do think that warlords like Joshua or David after him were not looking to make the world a safer place for children or a more righteous and peaceful place. I think they just wanted territory. They were no longer wandering pastoralists. They were also farmers. They were also becoming a military power. And as I said in previous volumes, the only way to concentrate a population so that you can grow large armies is through farming. Settling people down and forcing them to just grow a lot of grain. And so that's what happened in the classical period. That's what became of the Israelites. That 400 years between 1200 and 800 was spent getting settled in Canaan and figuring out their place in this new world. and a new ethnicity arose from the dust and the collision with the existing Canaanite cultures. And something similar happened in Greece. We need to talk a little bit about what happened to the Greek-speaking world after Odysseus. And in particular, we need to look at this figure again, named Theseus, and in the last volume, I equated him roughly with David. If you look at David as the emergence of the classical culture from the ruins of the Bronze Age, then we can look at Theseus as the representative of classical Greek culture emerging, this new ethnic identity from the confusion and the ruins left by Odysseus and his pals. Now, I am going to argue that the story of Theseus is much, much more mythologized. It's just more of a wild yarn, where Exodus has a lot of realistic elements with these touches of the fantastical thrown in. The story of Theseus dives headfirst into mythology. It's a wild story, and the first sign that Theseus may not have been an actual person lies in his name, because Theseus is related to the Greek word that we get thesis from, and it originally meant, more or less, a founder, somebody who establishes something. And what do you know? Theseus was considered the founder of Athens. He didn't build it. People had been living in that area for a long time. But Theseus made Athens what it became in the classical period. So this guy who happened to be named Founder founded stuff. What do you know? Now let's compare that to David, whose name, Dawid, translates to beloved, the beloved one. And so David's name doesn't exactly relate to anything that he did in life. And it turns out he was not very beloved by anybody. In fact, he was criticized and hated on by his own descendants and the descendants of his subjects. So what does the Theseus story have to say about how Greek culture formed during that dark 400 years between 1200 and 800? What happened in the Aegean after the surviving raiders and pillagers returned to their homes and trade collapsed, poverty ensued, people became illiterate, history was forgotten? It was a dark time. And Theseus was remembered primarily because of his labors, because of these special tasks that he completed. And the major ones involved King Minos and the Minoan kingdom that was centered on this very large island in the Aegean called Crete. And so what's so special about Crete? And how does this relate to the Bronze Age collapse? So first, let's contrast Theseus and David. While David was a primarily historical figure who was known for his injustices and led a people who were already united and conquered new territory, Theseus was different. He was a mostly mythological figure who was a figure of justice. And he was a person who defended and united people. He didn't attack his neighbors. And as far as the dating, some traditional chronologies place Theseus, if he lived, or the events surrounding that figure. Historians place that right around the time of Odysseus, the 1100s BC. But I go with the minority position that the story of Theseus covers events that happened around 900 BC, a little bit later, between 800 and 1000 BC. So Theseus definitely predates David, but I think not by much. And these two figures represent the different paths that were being taken, one in the east and one in the relative west. It's still the Eastern Mediterranean. We're talking about Athens here. The Theseus myth includes a lot of elements that I think are echoes of the Bronze Age collapse. And before we talk about the biggest connection, I think, with the Bronze Age collapse, let's talk about, for example, one of Theseus's accomplishments, which was to kill this guy Procrustes, who, interestingly, lived in Attica and had been terrorizing the population for a long time. Procrustes would kidnap people and tie them to a special bed, and if the person was too short for the bed, he would use chains to stretch the person out until they fit the bed, thus killing them. And then, if the person was too big for the bed, Procrustes would chop off parts of them until they fit, thus killing them. So notice this is almost like some sort of serial killer character. A serial killer loose in Attica, the territory surrounding Athens. So when Theseus kills Procrustes, he's not some sort of conquering figure like David. He's a defender, a protector of Attica. He's kind of like an Old West sheriff who's cleaning up a rotten town. Another antagonist that Theseus faced was the Bull of Marathon. And this monster was a fire-breathing bull that Theseus killed. And Marathon, famously, is a place on the eastern coast of Attica, which happens to be a great landing spot for an invading army that wants to take over the area surrounding Athens. And so Theseus loses his first battle with the bull, and the bull chases Theseus 26 miles. That's where the marathon race gets its name. And I'm just kidding. That's not true at all. Theseus kills the bull in Marathon. The 26-mile race, Marathon, does come from this place on the eastern coast of Attica. But the actual Marathon story is that in 490 BC, much, much later than Theseus, a Persian expeditionary force lands on the beach near Marathon in order to get their army on dry land to lay siege to Athens. And a defending force of Athenians stopped the Persians, and this messenger, this runner named Pheidippides, ran the whole 26 miles to Athens in record time, and with his dying breath, he told them, "Rejoice, we conquer." In other words, we won against the Persians, but more are coming, was the implication. That's the real story of Marathon. Now let's talk more about bulls. Theseus is famous for killing the Minotaur on the island of Crete, and he somehow managed to navigate the labyrinth. Now, the interesting thing is the Greek word for axe, in particular a double-bladed axe, is labrus, and labyrinthos could be translated as the place of the axes. The interesting thing is there seems to have been an actual King Minos, or Minos, who ruled over Crete, which was the center of the Minoan civilization during the Late Bronze Age. And the collapse of Minoan power over the Aegean was one of the major hallmarks of the collapse. So here we have this guy that would eventually found Athens, put it on the map as a secure city-state, And there's a legend of him being in this labyrinth, this place of axes on Crete. Well, King Minos's palace has been excavated, and it's huge. It kind of grew over time, so it has this confusing organic layout. And axes are a major symbol used in the artwork of the palace. It's a very sophisticated place. In fact, this Minoan palace was so advanced that it had running water. It had indoor plumbing. The pipes were made of terracotta, so they weren't even potentially poisonous, like Roman plumbing, much later on. So the Minoans were very advanced, and the relatively impoverished and unsophisticated Athenians at the time would see King Minos as this legendary figure. And probably Theseus's crowning achievement was the slaying of the Minotaur, the Minotaur. Now, that name translates to the Bull of Minos. And what do you know? Bulls were also very important in the Minoan religion, and bull-related artwork is extremely prominent in King Minos's palace. So I think that the Theseus myth not only gives us a sense of the danger and the chaos around Athens during the Dark Age that followed the Bronze Age collapse, it also seems to be an echo of Minoan dominance over Greece and its fading power. And when Theseus conquers this monster in the center of Minos's palace, it's a symbol of Athens breaking away from the fading power of the Minoan civilization. And sure enough, in the classical period, Crete was never a strong, independent power like it was in the Bronze Age. Well, I think that's it for this episode. I'll go ahead and tell you, it occurred to me what the next logical step might be, and it's kind of a wild one, but when you listen to the episode, hopefully it'll make sense. Next week, we're talking all about Atlantis. I mentioned it a couple of weeks ago. It's a strange thing because if Atlantis did exist, it was a civilization that predated the last reset around 10,000 BC. But the story of the civilization was given by the Egyptians to an Athenian statesman who reported the story in Athens and was eventually mentioned by Plato, and that is primarily how we know about the legend. So, we'll talk about all that. We'll talk about the evidence for Atlantis, problems with the idea, and if Atlantis was real, then where was it? When was it? How was it destroyed? Or why? We'll cover that next week. So, until then, talk to you later.